Um, those of you who are actually on the call and those of you who are listening to this in recording, you're all very welcome. This is the second actually in the kind of conversations we in Ulster University have tried to coordinate and stimulate around issues of the native languages in the north of Ireland, but also about how they would engage with each other and how they make a contribution to the culture and life of the wider community. And we in Ulster University are very lucky to have people who study and think and write and teach on all of the issues relating to those languages. And we thought that it would be a really good idea to start to encourage conversation on a constructive way across the community and with anybody who's interested both directly in the language, but also interested in this place. So you're all very welcome. The two speakers, my job as a sense is very easy. I'm the chair, I'll ask some questions. The format of today is also very simple. We have two speakers. We have Frank Ferguson, who is in the English department and has majored in Ulster Scots and in thinking and around how the Ulster Scots language sits and has developed and has contributed to life in Ulster. And on the other side, Neil Comer, who's a lecturer in Irish, who is also the chair of Conradh na Gaeilge and is an active enthusiast for the development of language and culture and engagement on that topic in the wider community. So having said that, the format is simple. I'm really going to ask both Frank and Neil to just start our thinking by making a few thoughts or opening conversations. Our native tongue is just a title to provoke and some thoughts. Probably after that, I'll have a short kind of conversation with the two speakers, just raise some questions. But after that, we hope that you, if you have questions or issues, will raise them. Maybe if you could put the questions in advance into the chat function. That's if you go to the participants function, you can put that into the chat, and we can try to put those into some kind of order and make sure that everybody gets a go. So we were talking earlier with the technical people who said that the best way for this to happen is for the listeners, please, to make themselves mute while they're listening. Obviously, if you have a question to ask or when we come to you, it might be, that's obviously when you unmute yourself, the classic Zoom moment. But I suppose if we want to start and just hear a few words, Frank, could I ask you just to introduce the topic from your angle?
Sure, I'm happy to go first on this. I suppose one of the things that Ulster Scots, as soon as you say the word Ulster Scots here, that already sets up a number of assumptions that people might make. And perhaps to look at it from a linguistic point of view, it's maybe worth remembering that Ulster Scots, as a sort of linguistic phenomenon, has its cake and eats it in a number of ways. The first way, and often the discussion about Ulster Scots is people say it's a dialect rather than a language. And the answer to that might be, first of all, to say, well, yes, it's a dialect, but a dialect of which language? So arguably, you can say that it's a dialect of English, but also that it's a dialect of the Scots language. So in a sense, it's maybe interesting to try and ponder exactly what we mean by dialect. But you can also say that it's a language because it's received minority language status, and it has a number of people who term themselves native speakers, and they feel quite comfortable in using the term language to describe what they say. So this sort of at once answers that question and also complicates it, because it can be more than one thing at the same time. And I think often this is one of the things that we need to think about with Ulster Scots, is that it's not necessarily one particular type of language phenomenon, but it's one of many, and it actually shifts and has elements that languages have often had, and we often think that it's something that has come along in the last 20 years rather than something that has grown and developed and moved and changed and shifted here over hundreds of years. So I think I'll stop there and let and let Neil come in.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And Duncan, I suppose the way I approach this and the way I approach the question of the Irish language or Gaelic language, that the two terms are used a lot. Initially, I suppose you ask yourself, why are we in the situation we are now in? We've moved from, within 300, 400 years of largely a sort of a monoglot Irish speaking country, to a stage now where the language is in a minority. The work that I have done and the work that Conor na Gaeilge does is is around the idea of language revival. And I suppose the approach that I take is that, number one, how can we bring people along with this? How can we convince people that the language is worth not just preserving, but promoting, growing, etc. And how can we make people feel a connectivity to the language? The number of people that actually don't realise that, again, even up until 100 years ago, there were pockets of native speakers still in Tyrone, Derry, Rathlinnan, for example, was majority Gaelic speaking until, I suppose, the early 1900s. So part of the work that I do and part of the question that I'd like to address is that, number one, how do we bring people back to the realization that this is part of their culture and part of a shared culture? And the second thing, the point that Frank makes about identifying a language or looking at aspects of a language, I think that I suppose and I'll talk about this a bit later, one of the greatest tragedies of this whole question is that this idea has come about maybe in the past 20 years that there are two distinctive set cultures. You have, the Gaelic Irish culture, and you have the Ulster Scots culture, and, that never the twain shall meet. And I think that we need to revisit this and realize that these are intertwined, and that if we realize the separate elements that are intertwined, then we can move forward on a much healthier basis. So that's really the approach that I'm coming from, the idea of getting people to recognize something that is there and something that's worth preserving and worth bringing forward.
Thank you very much. I suppose my first question is to Frank is, does this debate about whether it's a language or a dialect matter? Or can it ever be resolved? Or what is important about that?
I think it raises questions about prestige. I think first of all, I think this is often something that is done, and Irish has suffered from the sort of accusations that have been put against it. All languages are vulnerable in a sense, and in one sense, in a linguistic sense, linguists don't really distinguish or worry about what is a dialect and what is a language, because these don't really make much sense to them and what they look at. I think in cultural and political terms, I think the debate is often about trying to win a kind of cultural battle, and by terming something dialect can be seen as something lesser. If if one side has a language, the other side has only a dialect, and this raises a lot of it raises actually often a lot of times about the interesting things that people get anxious and annoyed about. So I think while it's worth looking into those questions, sometimes it's not really the best thing that we could be doing, because often the best thing is what Neil says about trying to preserve Irish, not just for the sake of it, but actually for the sake of, this is really important because it's part and parcel of who we are. And also, if you remove it, it's actually very difficult to tell the story of who we are, because if Irish was completely forgotten about in our cultural discourse, we would have a great gap in who we are. And the same for Ulster Scots. I would argue that in many ways, the majority of people in this part of the world use English to communicate with each other, but that's an English that is heavily inflected with both Irish and Scots in it. And if you remove an understanding of the nuances of that, you actually remove an understanding of the possibilities of what we're really talking about, because it takes away that big historical presence in our lives that Irish gives and that Ulster Scots gives as well, and is sort of cemented and glued together through English.
Neil, just building on that, I mean, the story of Irish in Ulster, how, I mean, it's a really long story, I suppose. I mean, it really is, that's about roots and all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I suppose it is a long story, and it reflects the story of Irish in Ireland to a general extent. And I mean, if we take it, I suppose, until the 17th century, Ireland, and Ulster was no exception to this, was a majority Gaelic speaking country, and it was for the most part monoglot. This is something that we have to understand as well, that, you know, English was a late arrival. English was a late development as a language itself in England, even in the landmass that is now known as England. You know, and in linguistic terms, a Gaelic speaking kingdom sort of stretched from the Western Isles of Scotland, you know, the whole way down, and there was a sort of a uniformity. There was a written Irish, you know, the scribes, etc. And you know, this was all, obviously the dialects of the language, of the Gaelic language, were different. Anytime I say Irish, by the way, I'm referring to Gaelic and vice versa. So if I drift in and out of terminology, that's just the way it's going to be. And there were other languages used sort of in the upper echelons of society. You know, you had Latin, obviously, from an ecclesiastical point of view. There was actually the use of French in more southern parts of Ireland, and then of course English did come in. But English was actually probably, if you go back to the 14th, 15th centuries, and in the, you know, I suppose the latter part of the 16th century, English was absolute minority language, and it was rare to find English in use in public life. But with the societal change, you know, if you take, you know, from the 1600s onwards, with the you know, the plantation of Ulster and various other plantations, this English became more and more present in public life. And then, of course, you know, you have this huge jump, and this was a gradual movement, but it really, you see the decline of the language happening in the 19th century, particularly after the famine. Now, the famine was had a huge impact on the Irish language as a community language in Ireland, because a lot of the people who died and emigrated were disproportionately Irish speakers. As well as that, policies began to come in place, educational policies which removed Irish from the curriculum, from the national schools curriculum. So, you know, this was a story that was happening throughout Ireland, but it was somewhat accelerated in Ulster by the presence of predominantly English speakers. English had sort of arrived to Ulster, and English and Lowland Scots, obviously, and also Scots. I mean, there are evidence of Scots Gaelic speakers coming in, and there's always that connection anyway between Scotland and the sort of northern coast and the Glens of Antrim, etc. So it was no surprise to see this influence. And really, the modern story of Irish in Ulster kicks off in the 1900s with the beginning of the revival movement with Conor na Gaeilge, and then you sort of move into this the 1920s, and it has to be remembered, and I mentioned this at the start, that what people don't realise is that there were native speakers, there were pockets of native speakers still, if you outside the Donegal Gaeltacht. If you take, for example, the Sperrins, if you look at the census reports from 1901 and 1911, there were areas that had over 50 to 60% native Irish speakers. You had the Red Bay in Antrim, you had still native speakers in Armagh, places like this. So the language as a native language, not as a revival, not as a second learned language, isn't actually that far away. And it really, the modern, the sort of trajectory of travel in the past 100 years has been about revival, has been about, you know, how do we go about reviving it? And how do we, as I mentioned at the start, how do we make people connect with something that's within living memory as a native language?
What is interesting, and I put this question to you both, is because it came a bit out of what you both said, is is the emphasis, or maybe it's not, and maybe it's not a choice, but I'm asking a question, on preservation or on promotion or growth, or and is there a difference in that? I'll come to that with you. And which is more important? Is it about preserving something about us in the past? Is it about trying to encourage the development of something in the future? Or what's the balance between those things?
I think it has to be a balance. I think sometimes, and I think that this is, all language movements have that question that they need to ask themselves, because at certain points in developing a language, it requires preserving. It regards safeguarding that, like languages, even, you know, if they're not a global language like English, which in many ways is driven now from American English, and almost one might say, you know, global American English. So this is relatively safe and secure. But other languages like Irish, like Scots and Ulster Scots, is vulnerable, because often those speech communities are you know, are aging. Words get lost, and you know, the usages of the language can get lost, particularly if you're moving from an agricultural kind of world, or a world of the countryside, in which the jobs and the, you know, the language that you use for everyday life is no longer needed in new generations. But the difficulty is, if you're only seeking to preserve, then it becomes a kind of museum piece. And language works best when it's edgy, and particularly, you know, we look at popular culture, and the language there is often, you know, a much more edgy and alive and vibrant and daring kind of language. So in a sense, while we need to kind of shore things up, we also need to go to the places where there's a bit of experimentation needed, and a bit of allowing people to enjoy and play with the language. And this is the big difficulty, I think, sometimes that native speakers and language activists have, because that sometimes if you play with language, it gets taken over by other groups who will run with it and develop it and rejuvenate it. But it also won't necessarily be that concept of the language that you have. And we see this part of the world is very, very good at those who want to hold on to a certain interpretation of what a language is, and are on one hand would love other people to share in it, but on the other have anxiety that if it's shared and used, it could go to a whole new set of places that it runs away from you.
I'm reminded of the fact that since they'd opened up the Booker Prize, almost 3/4 of the nominees turn out to not be from these islands. They're coming all from Africa nowadays. Yeah. Neil, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I have to agree with Frank, and I think that there's a great lesson here to be taken from the Irish language revival movement, as it's been probably in the late, I suppose, when the late 1800s, when Conor na Gaeilge began, there had been literally a preservation movement beforehand. But the idea then was, and it was all, the language was looked upon almost like Latin or classical studies, etc. And the idea was to study the language purely from an academic point of view. And I think it was, great credit must be given to Douglas Hyde, Douglas Dahidja, who, you know, the founder of Conor na Gaeilge and went on to be the first president of Ireland, because he realised that, you know, yes, preservation is obviously necessary, and you need to preserve things to have a foundation, but you need to promote and you need to bring the language into new settings, new live settings. And I think Frank's absolutely right. You know, you need to allow a language to develop naturally within language communities. So the idea is, you know, the idea of having language just almost as an academic study or whatever, and we've seen this has happened with languages before, even huge, massive languages like Latin, as it was at the time, and I knew they broke into a lot of different dialects, but it became completely and totally as an academic language. I think that with the Gaelic language, and indeed with Ulster Scots, as we move on, yes, absolutely preserve because you need that solid basis and you need the solid foundation of vocabulary, language, and the cultural, the things that go with it culturally. But you do need to move on, and you do need to put the language into new contexts and let people experiment with the language. There's this huge fear almost that, if you let languages become too modernized, that they're somehow corrupted. But language corrupts themselves. Language corrupts itself. It has been doing so for thousands of years. Just go to any language that's developed, and it doesn't need, it doesn't need to be put into the hands of a teenager with a great imagination about rap music for it to change. It's going to change anyway. So, we have to accept that fact.
Yeah, I'm interested in this notion that you've suggested, which is that part of the health of the future of languages is the health of the language communities. In other words, there's the academic and, if you like, the curatorial part of the whole thing, and making sure that, it is in a formal sense, but the health of that within the community seems to be a critical issue, if you know what I mean, how we
engage
with that in everyday life and in usage.
It's building that confidence. I think it's allowing a community to understand that it's okay to use that language. I think one of the things, and I think a lot of the things that Neil talks about that came along in the 19th century, such as national schooling and the setting of standards, is the thing that has caused a lot of cultural cringe in this part of the world, that there's an anxiety about being, standing up and saying and using the form of speech that you grew up in, and then that you maybe came across in areas like school or whatever, or in the wider society that seem problematic. So I think part of the mission is to find ways of allowing you to sort of settle into what your native tongue actually is, because I think if we looked at any sort of natural speech of people from here, that it has elements of Ulster Scots, it has elements of Irish, it has elements of English, that in a sense it's not even a case of learning a new language, it's learning where the things that you actually say in the places that you live in, how they connect to Irish or Ulster Scots or English in a variety of the layers that make up who you are as a person.
Obviously when you're sitting here and you have two people having a conversation, there are parallels and distinct differences. So the question I'd ask Neil is, what would you consider the big success stories of the language revival of recent years?
Well, I suppose in the point of view of Ulster, I'd have to point to two major developments. And if we go back to the 1970s, the early 70s, you have the Gaeltacht on the Shaw's Road in Belfast. And this was, and I have to emphasize the word community here, because this is the key to language survival, where a number of young married couples decided that they were going to create essentially a language community, and they did so by they built houses, basically got some land and built houses, and it was from that. And there were a small number of families there, but these families got together, and really it was from this, and obviously with other people, that the Irish language movement, the Irish medium schools movement grew, where this small community where their children grew up together, their children played together, but it was all through the medium of Irish. I think we're now through to it's actually probably the fourth generation is probably been born at the stage of that initial language community. That has grown to what is now arguably a very, very successful language community in Belfast. And that influenced smaller communities throughout Ulster. A more recent development is in Carntocher, which is, excuse me, just outside Maghera. And Carntocher actually was, in the 1920s, probably one of the last Gaeltacht regions in Ulster, in Derry, where you had sort of near the Sperrins, where you had smattering of native speakers left. There was a revival movement to an extent, but things had gone flat. The area had, like many rural areas, suffered from depopulation, suffered from lack of investment. And I say about 20 to 25 years ago, the local community got together, again, spearheaded by a number of very, very focused individuals, and they set up an Irish language nursery school that went on to an Irish language primary school. They reopened the local post office with a shop around it and an interpretive centre, etc. And this has grown now to the Irish language secondary school in Dungiven, which began with 13 pupils and has something like 60 coming in this year. You know, there's well nearly 200 students in the school. But the emphasis is that this came from the community, and any successful movement, if we sit and wait, and this applies to Irish, and this applies to Ulster Scots, whilst we need government support, there's no question about that. Finance, funding, etc., is very, very important. But if we wait on a direction from the government or from officialdom, it won't work. It has to come. The demand has to come from the community, and it has to grow upwards and then be supported. So they have been the major successes.
And if you maybe put the other side of the coin to Frank, which is, you know, is Ulster Scots threatened in the current situation? Is it worth preserving? You know, is it something we should be prioritising, or at least giving a certain priority to?
I think I think with all minority languages, in a sense, when there's not adequate support or maybe a drive to look after them, that they are vulnerable. And I think Ulster Scots is vulnerable in a way. And I think I would echo what Neil is saying, that the successes that Ulster Scots have had in the production of you know, sort of reclaimed texts and you know, the important artifacts of its historical literature has often been driven not by, you know, sort of government initiative, but by personal and community initiative. And I think it's allowing support for those initiatives to keep going, because often there is there's groups of people out there who are keen to do this, and they would if there was actually the adequate support. And I think that's also one of the things that the approach that the Irish language movement has done is one that could work in certain circumstances as well for Ulster Scots. I think to say, you know, to ask, you know, if Ulster Scots just disappeared now, would we lose anything? I think if you look back at the individuals who were writers in Scots and Ulster Scots from here, to lose that is actually losing a sizable chunk of the literary history that we have. To lose Scots is actually to lose, you know, even looking at somebody like Seamus Heaney, while on one hand you would not by any stretch of the imagination say that Heaney was an Ulster Scot, but when you look at how significant Scots language and the literature of Scotland and the literature of those inheritors was to his work and how he saw the world, I think then we're kind of wiping out a part of Heaney's you know, sort of cultural baggage. So I also think that it's just been intrinsic in the mentality of here that you know, we can't in a way go back to the 14th century, you know, because that is not who we are. We are not a late medieval people anymore, but we're who we are now, and everything that has happened in those you know half a millennia has actually shaped us to who we are. And you know, leaving aside the political question, the cultural richness of our speech is framed by these combinations of languages, and new languages yet to come, because you know we are an island that admits other settlers with different languages, with new and intriguing ways of saying things. And it's that openness, on one hand, to hold on to where we were, but to acknowledge who we might be with the influx of new people. And ultimately, you know, I think if we think about our language as a sort of, you know, that part of our DNA, there's lots of sort of spiky Ulster Scots genes in there that we can't get rid of anyway. And that actually understanding them goes a long way to understanding what we're actually saying to each other, because there are so many nuances in and things that we think we understand that other people are saying, but without that understanding of the intricacies of our speech and the way we think and how that unique way that we see the world, without understanding that, we'll not understand ourselves, and we'll not understand the people in the next room to us.
This is a conversation as part of Culture Night from Ulster University. I'd like to ask the people who are listening if they have any questions, they can start to prepare them, because they might come to them in a wee second. But maybe I'll ask both of you, just to conclude this kind of conversational part of the event, how you think the languages could work together, and on what kind of issues they might try to seek progress together, or whether you think they're terminally in opposition to each other.
Well, I think that one of the greatest tragedies of the whole question and the whole debate is that this, I'm not going to use the word polarization, but the very fact that we're talking about these as two separate, cultural forms, or two separate cultural identities. The view that prevails that sort of this is ours, that's yours, and as mentioned earlier on, never the twain shall meet. This shouldn't be the way that we approach this. You just need to look at, for example, the Hamely Tongue by James Fenton, or the Concise Ulster Dictionary that Caroline McAfee put out, to realise the level or the influence that, for example, the Gaelic language has had on English spoken in many parts of Ulster, and what is deemed to be Ulster Scots. But if we consider music and song and dance, if we look at this in a more holistic way rather than purely in a linguistic way, things that are now considered as Irish music and things that are considered as from an Ulster Scots tradition, they both came from the same cradle. You have the same tunes, you have the same dance forms. These aren't things that grew up independently within an Ulster Scots tradition or within an Irish Gaelic tradition. And I think that what we need to do is to examine, I suppose, the elements of each culture, what the elements of each culture are. And I'm certain that we're going to see that there's not a huge difference in their genesis. It's what they've gone on to represent in some people's eyes is the problem. That's a different matter altogether. And that's, something that people need to move away from. I know people who would consider themselves to be very, and I don't want to go down a political line, but people who consider themselves to be nationalist, Republican. But when you listen to their speech, when you look at their way of lives, it's as Ulster Scots as you can get, and it's vice versa. There are people within the Gaelic speaking community that, you look at how their approach to life or whatever, and you might think, oh, that's actually more of a sort of a unionist point of view to things. So I think that we have to push that to one side for a minute and examine them as cultures and languages. And I think, for example, if you take Ulster Scots poetry, and Frank is in a far better position than I am to speak about this, but Ulster Scots poetry places a huge emphasis on the concept of home and your native place. And Frank mentioned earlier on the agricultural background from which we came. I mean, Gaelic poetry does exactly the same. It's not any different. It's not that Gaelic poetry is talking about something completely different. I mean, Wordsworth did the same. But that's another story altogether. The medium is different, but the message and the underlying sense of belonging to place is the same. So I think that we need to move away from viewing these as two separate traditions and two separate cultures. I think we need to look at the elements and see, look, these are inextricably mixed.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we could try and get away from is that seeing language here as a race. Often it boils down into certain words, and if there's almost a sense, if you can get to the finish line first, you can claim that word, and it no longer becomes Irish or Ulster. It no longer becomes Ulster Scots or Irish. It becomes whatever you want to be, and the ownership of that word is. So you can see it in all host of words like Fran, Sleeket, Clabber, Crack, especially. Words that we are interchangeable, words indeed that you can quite argue quite logically and rationally that belong to both spaces at the same time. So I think it's a case of forgetting about that kind of race mentality in the first past the post way of looking at it, but to think of it perhaps as a spectrum of language, that just like the fact that we go out into the daylight, that we go out into a variety of linguistic sounds and words and vocabulary that we all share and that we all understand, and actually perhaps understanding it better would actually be one of the things to get away from the Irish English sort of two poles, to actually understand the Ulster Scots that resides within Irish, and that shared future of linguistic exchange between Scotland and Ireland that has been going on for, ever since St. Patrick was, repatriated to do a bit of work here for us. I think we might try and understand that a bit more, and also see for ourselves as human beings, and I hate the word journey, but we're actually, as individuals, we often go on a journey of language, so that if you imagine how you spoke before primary school, how you spoke and used language in primary school and secondary school, and on into your work or university life and beyond, that you go through a number of registers. And in those registers are the mixture of English, Ulster Scots and Irish, and that perhaps at no point, at certain points, you can see a sort of fixed usage of your language, but beyond that is, a shifting and a bringing on of new things and new ways of saying and understanding where you are in the world. And I think that sort of journey effect is a very useful one for us to take, because in a sense we are going somewhere, we hope, and if we can only understand what we're saying, why we're saying it, who we're saying it to, this is actually really productive, and it affirms who we are and celebrates who we are. And it also gives us the potential to celebrate the other person's use of their language without it being politicized, but being something for celebration and commemoration and for understanding and ultimately for communication. Because I think this is one of the things that we need to do better, and we need to understand who we are in the world better.
When you started there, Frank, and started to talk about, I think we have to stop treating like a race. I know you meant it as a race in a competition. And actually my mind went to the politics of race, where it's seen as a kind of something separate types of humanity, separate streams of human beings. And we have to stop treating it like that, which sometimes gets involved in this conversation in this part of the world. So I think there's an interesting play in words on that.
Yes.
We've had a long conversation here already. I am looking to see if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, who's listening to this and who has their own take or would like to make a point, and then see how the speakers would take it. Please feel free to do so. I'll give you 30 seconds. If nobody does, I will ask my own questions and we'll carry on. Sean.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting conversation. And as like Neil talked about, about different words and stuff. Myself, I remember I'm from North Monaghan, growing up in a bar, and I used to write down every night, hear the people speaking, and then I was lucky enough to come across the concise Oxford Dictionary on the dialect of Ulster, and to see words that I didn't realise that were of the Ulster Scots background. So that was fairly fantastic. I don't know. I noticed there, but I'm very conscious about how we talk about stuff, about things being political and non-political and stuff. And I suppose life is about politics is about life. So you can't always get away from that. I suppose for communities looking for resources, looking for better support and stuff, that is a form of political demand and such. I suppose the most important thing is to move away from it, the perception that it's belonging to political parties, or or that one political party or two political parties is seen to own certain sections of our culture. I think some of the work needs to be done there is whereby all political parties have engage with all the different aspects of our culture here, so that it's not seen to be one side running with one thing and then therefore, that group is running with it, so therefore we have to, we're necessarily against that. So it's all about, at the end of the day, it's about communities and listening to communities, and to listen to what them communities need and at any particular time. So that's just my wee piece there.
No,
Can I come in, Duncan,
I think,
on what Sean said there?
I'm going to just amplify that question because I think it's a really important question on two sides. One is the necessity of politics. You can't avoid looking for a resource, looking for support, looking for engagement, looking for public acknowledgement on all of that part of politics. And then the experience here, which is that politics also means partisanship, and language gets tied up with it's mine or yours, and any penny you get must be a penny I should get, and all this kind of thing. I just wondered on your reflections in general, but where could we make progress on a useful, a really constructive engagement with politics, rather than just saying we're just going to leave it aside? What does that look like?
Can I come in just on the point that Sean made? And it is actually, it's hopefully I'll address the questions about the politics. It's very interesting. Where I live, it's North County Derry, even though you'll tell from my accent that I'm not a native. But the area that I live in would be considered linguistically within that sort of band of Ulster Scots. So therefore, my children, you can hear a lot of the intonation and a lot of the phrases that they use are arguably fit into the Ulster Scots linguistic profile. But they're both Irish speakers. Are both brought up speaking Irish. And I remember a few years ago, one of them said the word butter and pronounced it as butter, right? And I just happened to say, and this was when she was sort of coming of age, beginning to have sort of political viewpoints, whatever. And I said, that's a fine bit of Ulster Scots you had there. And she was aghast. But when I sat, this is years ago now, the things thankfully have changed. But when I explained to her, I said, and she said, "But no, that's not. I'm not speaking Ulster Scots. That's just." But when I sat, it got me thinking. And this is what I suppose was one of the earlier thoughts that I've had about this whole conversation. That why can we not? Why can I not have this? I suppose it's a bit like the sort of far right and far left politics. If there's something that appeals to me on the far left of politics, and there's something that appeals to me in the far right, and there's something that appeals to me in the centre, why can I not take part in all of those, or why can I not support all of those? And I think that this comes back to Sean's absolutely right. Yes, there does need to be a political involvement to an extent, but at the same time we can't let politics take ownership of all these different aspects. You should be allowed as a person to choose the things that suit you and the things that fit into your belief in how politics should go, and the same with language and culture. If it's something that's a natural part of your growing up, your surroundings, the language you hear, there's no one has the right to say, well, actually, you can't say butter because you're an Irish speaker and because you have nationalist tendencies. So I think that you are right, Duncan. This is the political part of it is a massive discussion as well that does need to happen. So,
yeah, I think it's I was thinking before the talk about what needs done, and my thinking was, on one hand, there's certain elements that need depoliticized and a stepping back and almost an acceptance that this is something that can't be a political football, but often is, and also a politicization in which we almost allow ourselves to see the need for it. The almost the idea of the language that we grew up with, or the language that we aspire to, has an incredibly important bond in us. It's an incredible yearning which in many ways goes beyond politics, because it's tied up with selfhood, with identity, with our own sense of who we actually are as a human being. And I think to politicize that is almost that it's not something that we see as important for ourselves or our group or whatever tribe that we're part of, but that we accept that that's really an important part of who we see ourselves as part of humanity, and that we safeguard that for ourselves, but also for others, and learn to move away from the, those sort of, as soon as you say butter, that has you marked out as a certain type of person. It's that, and I think it's a global phenomenon that I think that we're dealing with, because I think it's about, the concept of educating, that I think people have, been brought on by things like Black Lives Matter and the idea of gender fluidity and all of those things. Actually, language fluidity is probably one of the politics that we need to be aware of. It's being aware that this is a person of language, rather than an Ulster Scots or an Irish speaker, which suggests certain things. I think we have to allow ourselves to go to certain places. And one thing Sean will say, the dictionary that you talk about, it had initially been devised for schools, so that there was a whole lot of bad language that was used from an Irish Ulster Scots point of view, which they didn't put forward, and I think is sitting somewhere in an archive in the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. And this is one of the things that we maybe have to allow ourselves to grow up and realize there's all this fantastic language there that's preserved, that we probably are all still using, and you probably heard a lot of it in the bar.
Right.
And please don't use it for a family show at this point. But this is one of the things that, in a sense, we have to reclaim that. There's a politics there of reclamation, and this is something that we should be involved in, because there's so many other things out there sort of pressing in the world that take away our own uniqueness. It's one of those things that we have to allow ourselves to be ourselves, and to see that sort of cultural history and richness that if we lose it forever. And
I'm laughing at the fact that we're at our most polyglot when we're swearing. It's good.
Yes.
Paula, do you have any questions or anything you want to say, or is there anything you'd like to add?
I was just going to ask Neil Comer, what exactly do you mean when you say, it's weird to speak to you in English, it's very difficult. When you say that someone speaks in Ulster Scots, but perhaps they have more, I'm going to use the wrong term, kind of Irish style of life, or vice versa, what exactly do you mean by that?
I mean that, for example, if you take, and this is going to sound hugely stereotypical, but it's the best way, I suppose, to explain it. If you consider your Irish speaker or your Gaelic speaker at the minute, particularly young people who play Gaelic football, hurling, camogie, they have a certain political point of view or whatever, and there is that, and we can't move away from that. So that's the sort of the viewpoint that there is about them. But then suddenly they step out of that into their English speaking environment. And again, I can use my daughter as an example, who, when she goes into an English speaking environment, into Garva, for example, which is just beside us near Ballymoney, that whole area, suddenly you hear someone speaking in English in exactly the same way as all the other kids who are from what you could easily say from an Ulster Scots background. And to me, it's an anomaly, but it's something that has got me thinking, in recent times, saying, because you speak in a certain way, are you, and this is definitely more prevalent, absolutely more prevalent in the north than it is, for example, in Dublin and the rest of Ireland. But there is still this huge idea of, if you are an Irish speaker, you are supposed to follow a certain path in life, and if you're an Ulster Scots speaker, or you're from an Ulster Scots tradition, that you're supposed to follow this as well. And to me, the pity is that that's that the things can't cross, like they actually have done in other areas. Okay, I heard somebody saying
Sir
hello
Rogers?
in there. Yeah,
Sir
Mohit, follow.
Sorry, is it Neil's going off or is it me going off?
No, no, I'm still here.
No.
I'm still.
No.
Nice. Rant over.
No, not at all. I suppose I would like to kind of just as we're coming to the end, ask a couple of questions. One is, what are the advantages of a bilingual or a multilingual or an interlingual approach? What do you think are the benefits for the wider society? I'll ask either of you. Anybody want to pick that one up?
I think there are lots of studies out there that look at the educational attainment of children who come from bilingual or multilingual backgrounds, and they do better. They have the ability to not just to work with language, but to work with a lot of things. And I think that's one of the things. It's better. It's stronger. I think even looking at some of the work that's done in Scotland, where people are teaching using Scots rather than English, and while that this is not, and also Scots as being seen maybe as, a less respectable form of English. When they teach in Scots, the people who might in the past have been seen as educationally challenged are completely flipped around, because they're using their everyday language to solve the problems that you solve in the classroom. And it's actually not a case that they're challenged in any certain way. It's just that they have had a different language for understanding and seeing the world. And they have real strengths that a classroom which is open to using and embracing that language has, it gives a very powerful message and actually shatters the concept sometimes of educational attainment. And I think it's just one of those things. It recognizes what's really going on in the people who are sitting in the room, and it's celebrating that. I think one of the big challenges that culture here has for 400, 500 years has been being able to find ways of recognizing all the cultural expression that there is in the landmass, and celebrating that and treating that equitably and allowing it to flourish. And I think it's that aspect of how can we make things flourish, because not just always to focus on education, but in certain ways the education system here produces really top tier students, but it also struggles with those people from certain backgrounds in certain areas, and it may well struggle because it doesn't recognize the linguistic strength that might well be in those areas, alongside all the other issues, of course, of poverty and deprivation. But it may not just be able to reach those communities that don't use a particular form of expression and don't have the right kind of cultural capital that would help them get on.
Yeah, it's the same idea, I suppose. One man's standard is another man's Creole. Like, it's, Frank's absolutely right. And I think that the first thing that you mentioned there about the cognitive benefits, obviously the benefits of bilingualism are there. We know that the studies have been done. But I think too, in the case of, particularly in the case of Ireland, where that's, if we take the issue of identity, obviously that's there. But if we take, for example, the connectivity to the country, to the history, if we take our place names, for example, straight away, knowledge of the language, particularly Irish, automatically connects us to the geographical history of the land, the historical elements, in terms of, you can take the industrial history as well. There are also concepts in languages that can't be automatically translated to English. And this is the same for Irish as for Ulster Scots. If I say, for example, the word Cayley, which is, a word that transcends the cultures, people know exactly what that means. But please tell me, if somebody can explain that in one go, because it's not just a dance. It's the whole idea of a gathering, people coming together from Caola, which means together, so the idea of concepts. And there are loads of examples of that, but also, preserving and promoting the language, to me, it creates a self-confidence, which is a justification in itself. It doesn't say that every single, person in Ireland needs to speak Irish, or every Welsh person needs to speak Welsh. But if I can pull back to the example earlier on of Carntáthar outside Mahara, this was an area that 25, 30 years ago was wiped out through emigration, a very, very rural area. And the language has acted as a glue for the community, and but Sean will know this, as will Paula, that this has now created a community from which we have the hugely successful Slaughtneil GAA club that have won everything in every code, and this is no coincidence. You know, this has kept people in the community. I'm not saying that everyone there is an Irish speaker, but a confidence has grown in the community, and the language has had a huge, huge part to play in that.
One final question. We've had an hour, and we're just coming to the end of the hour. I think it's been fascinating conversation. What I heard from you both there was, you know, there are ways into this which don't require us necessarily to just go to the most polarizing things. That some of the issues which might be about would be, how do you nourish the language communities? How do you actually recognize some of the wealth that's already there? How do you create learning opportunities that are real, genuine? Can we move this conversation into sport and arts, but also into history and the curriculum and in the English curriculum and so on, in the educational things? In other words, that actually, if we took an approach which was, how do we nourish the health of our linguistic cultures, we could actually come up with quite a wide range of things you could do, which would really put roots down and begin to make this a much less, if you like, I don't know, polarized conversation, and actually one where everybody has a stake to make it work. Anybody want to comment on that?
I think it's also the case that often the nourishment has come from, you know, one particular place, rather than looking at things in the round and seeing how you could join up.
Yeah.
Like, often big initiatives fail because they do that awful cliche of trying to reinvent the wheel, because they ignore and they trample over the really vibrant community development that's going on, because people are driven there not by funding applications, but because they can't do anything but want to hold on to the thing that propels them so powerfully. So I think often it has been a case that there's been lots of really good Irish initiatives and lots of really good Ulster Scots initiatives, but they haven't linked. And the real trick is actually to link together and to provide, you know, a very, very broad community approach rather than the two community approach, because often there's so much crossover and so much potential for sharing if there isn't actually already sharing, that you need those two groups together.
Neil, you get the last word. Yeah, I think we have to start looking at the commonalities rather than trying to be, you know, the two distinctive cultures. Look at the elements, and we will find, and I'm convinced of this until proven otherwise, but I don't think it will happen. I don't think it will be proven otherwise. That there are far more similarities that grow from a common. We're talking about people here. We're talking about people that have grown over, you know, centuries, and that they haven't grown thinking, I'm this, you're that. They have maybe in a religious or political point of view, but in terms of everyday culture, habits, things that we now consider to be, you know, intrinsic parts of native culture, you'll find that there's a lot more in common than we actually think, and I think that that's what we have to build on.
Listen, that has been another fascinating conversation. Can I just say thank you both very much for putting all that effort into that. I think it was a really, really focused and well thought through piece of work. Can I also thank all the people who joined us and who asked questions and made comments, and anybody who's listening, I hope you find it interesting. We hope to do another one of these as part of the Economic and Social Research Council's annual week later on in November, and we will be looking at opportunities to develop these conversations in Ulster later on. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of Culture Night.
Yep. All right, folks.
Thank you.
Recording off.